Alrighty folks, and welcome to the Chronicler Podcast channel. Episode 13, Legalism. Now, just a quick reminder, if you are new here, make sure you're subscribed to my show on any social media platform such as Facebook, Instagram or Twitter to keep you up to date for when I release new episodes. Also, be sure to tell your friends about the show, if they are interested in Chinese history, that is. Now that that's out the way, where were we? Ah yes, in today's podcast we're going to move away from Confucianism and Taoism and turn to legalism. Now before I move forward, if you have no idea what Confucianism or Taoism is, check out my previous podcasts, just because in order to understand legalism, you need the basics of Confucianism and Taoism. The reason being that legalism is almost like a direct challenge to these other philosophies, and they conflict on pretty much every level. So legalism, where did it start? That's a good question, and to tell you the truth, there isn't a clear-cut point of origin. However, I cannot stress this enough. Legalism as a political ideology almost does have a point of origin, and it begins with three men. You have Shen Yang, Han Feizi, and Li Si as well. But before I get into the lives of those three men, which are pretty interesting, I better go with the basics of legalism and the philosophy itself. Legalism, like I said, is the total opposite of Confucianism. So, Confucianism believes that humans are good? Wrong. Legalists argue that all humans are bad. Now one could ask, where is the evidence that humans are bad? To which a legalist such as Han Feizi would say, have you looked outside? The entire world is at war. Not only that, on every level of society, people are self-serving criminals. At the top, you have corrupt bureaucrats who'll accept any bribe they see fit. And at the bottom level, soldiers rape and pillage villages. Regular bandits steal from anyone they come across. And the list just keeps going on and on and on. I guess, if you were to sum up legalism quickly, you could simply compare it to the donkey with the carrot and the stick theory. For those of you who do not know the theory, it goes a little like this. Let's say there's a farmer who has a donkey, but that donkey doesn't really obey the farmer in any way. So the farmer needs to figure out a way to control the donkey's behaviour. So every time the donkey does something the farmer wants it to do, the farmer will give it a carrot. Every time it does something the farmer doesn't want it to do, he will beat it with a stick. Eventually, the donkey listens to your commands, or the farmer's commands in this case. Now legalism is similar to that, apart from, from what I've seen anyway, one fundamental change, and that is, instead of awarding the donkey with a carrot, you just tell it that you won't kill it that day. Legalism focused all on the punishment side of things, rather than more on the rewards. The theory is, if you beat something or someone enough without any rewards, they'll obey you anyway. So why give them a reward? This is what legalism strives for. Now moving forward towards the Qin dynasty, you'll see what I mean with the rewards and punishment thing. It got kind of ugly. But for now, this is the theory kind of in a nutshell. Now this is why I am unsure where legalism did truly originate. Just because this was already in place somewhat in Chinese societies in the past. Think about it. Jails already existed before, right? So did capital punishment. So this isn't really a new idea. I think the fundamental difference is, however, that it finally got put into writing and got turned into a political theory. I think the fundamental difference between legalism and Confucianism can also relate to power. Confucianism believes that power is won through kindness, whereas legalism believes power is contained within the kings of the time and issuing out extremely harsh punishments. So like Confucius would argue that it's a wise emperor would share power with his officials, whereas legalists would argue, no, that should not happen. All the power should be kept by the king, or the emperors later on. Now remember how Confucius scholars said that the rulers of realms should be kind to his nobles and subjects? Legalists argue that this is a load of nonsense. Now, to quote Han Feizi, he said, "It is dangerous for the ruler to trust others. He who trusts others can be manipulated by others." Now, doesn't this sound so much like Machiavellianism? Isn't it crazy how similar theories can be thought of in different areas and in different time periods? Anyway, moving on from Renaissance Italy and diving back into ancient China, the quote from Han Feizi does show how legalists would think and their view on statecraft. And I mean, they kinda had a point. During the spring and autumn period, when legalism was getting thought of, and even in later unified Chinese dynasties, was there anyone the emperor or the king at the time could fully trust in their imperial courts? If we were to ask all of China's previous emperors today, the vast majority of them would more than likely have said no. Behind every smiley face was a dagger, poised, waiting to cut down emperors who showed any signs of weakness. Or maybe these faithful ministers could simply get a child emperor and make that emperor dance like a puppet on their strings. Now, to counter this, the emperor, according to legalists, should hand out all punishments and rewards to everyone, regardless of rank. The only person immune to these laws would be none other than the emperor themselves. That way, the kings of the spring and autumn period can control their own courts. Or as the theory would say anyway. So that's enough on legalism, I reckon. I could keep going, but I think you get the general point. Legalism doesn't care for virtue. It doesn't care about people being good. Legal cares about how to control people's natural impulses, which are fundamentally bad. And the theory explains ways in which emperors or kings should control these impulses through extremely harsh punishments. I'll squeeze in a couple more examples here. So let's say you are a minister and you have been ordered to ship 500 kilograms of grain from point A to point B, and you have a deadline of 5 days. What happens if you take 6 days? Execution? You're correct. What happens if you do it quicker than 5 days? Also execution. You weren't allowed to showboat in front of the king and make him look bad now. And then you have the usual, if you are a thief, you will not only get your hands chopped off, but you'll also get your tongue chopped off, just to give you an idea of how harsh a legalist regime would be. Now I remember reading somewhere that Han Feizi himself said, be extremely harsh on small crimes. That way it doesn't escalate into bigger crimes. So here's another example of that. So now, I will move on to the proponents of legalism, the men who thought of it and wrote it down. Well, to be fair, there's only one guy who really writes it down, but the other two put it more into practice. So without further ado, I'll start with the first legalist on my list, and his name is Shang Yan. Shang Yan was born at around 390 BC in the state of Wei, and he would meet a rather grim demise in the year 338 BC. But more on that later. Shang Yan didn't serve the state of Wei, however, and instead took his fancy ideas and went to serve Duke Xiao of Qin. Now, for those of you who don't know where these places are, Wei is kinda in the middle of the old Zhou realm, and Qin was on the western border for the most part. So in today's terms, he didn't travel that far. Duke Xiao was extremely impressed with Shang Yan, and the latter rose through the ranks extremely quickly within the Qin realm. Straight away, he began a series of pretty radical reforms for the time. For example, he instituted compulsory military service, strict laws which apply to everyone, and also agricultural reforms. And what I mean with agricultural reforms is that basically he only created 2 jobs within the realm of Qin. You were either a soldier or a farmer. No merchants allowed. Women were obviously not eligible to be soldiers at the time, so their job was to farm and have children. Were these policies harsh? Yes. But did they gear the Qin up for the final showdown with all of the other states? Also yes. Harsh but effective administration, basically. Now, did these reforms conflict with the interests of the nobles under Duke Xiao? Oh yes, they did. The only thing that was keeping Shenyang alive was his closeness with the Duke. But what would happen if he, I don't know, were to die? You guessed it, those nobles would go after him like wolves after a sheep. And that is exactly what happened. Duke Xiao died, and then the nobles came after Shenyang. I read the little tale that Shenyang tried to go into hiding, and tried to hide in a tavern while soldiers were looking for him. However, it was past the curfew time, and the landlord refused to let him in fear of punishment. Shenyang sighed and muttered that his laws were almost too effective. What a twist of irony for the dude. So, when he was caught, the nobles were really unsure on how to kill him. But then they thought of a brutal way to do it. In order to appease heaven for the brutality that his administration adopted, they tied his legs and arms to 4 separate chariots, and at the same time the chariots ran at full speed, which literally quartered Shenyang's body in what sounds like a horrific scene. Honestly, I thought medieval Europe was brutal at times. Just look at ancient China if you have the chance. Some of the stuff that happened is just nuts. So, that's Shenyang's story told. Now I know this was brief, but there are 2 more men I want to cover in this episode, and I don't want to drag out for too long. I'm just giving you the basics. So, the next man on the list is Han Feizi, who was probably the most notable legalist of all. Han Feizi was born in 280 BC and he died in 233 BC, and again, his death is rather an interesting story, which we'll get to later. Han Feizi was born in the state of Han, which again borders the state of Qin. Han was a relatively weak state with not much land, and the land it did have couldn't really support a lot of agriculture. And why is that? Because it was mostly mountainous. Now I think I've already mentioned this, but in case I didn't, scholars tended to drift between different states and periodically serve that state, then move on. It was common practice for that to happen during the spring and autumn period. Han Feizi, on the other hand, was actually a prince of Han, so he wasn't really in a position to be able to do this. In his philosophical career, Han Feizi actually started off as a pupil under a notable Confucian scholar by the name of Sun Si. Han Feizi, as you could already imagine, didn't really agree with Confucian principles at all, and because of this, he never really got a position within the Han court. Han Feizi is also said to have had a stutter, which made him useless when engaging in a debate. I mean, think about it. This was a time when the way that you articulate an argument, the beautiful way that you address an issue is fundamental to get anywhere in life. Now, what happens if you're a stuttering idiot? You're not going to get anywhere. Now, the thing is, what Han Feizi couldn't really say, he wrote. And I mean, he wrote it very well. So, I mean, as much as people might have thought he was a stuttering idiot, he was a stuttering idiot who could write better than anybody else. Now, Han Feizi wrote many essays about statecraft and how rulers should act, and 2 of them are called the 5 Vermin and the Difficulties of Persuasion. But despite his really good writing ability, ideas and techniques, within the Heart Court, it all fell on deaf ears. But while Han Fei's writing caught the attention of nobody in the state of Han, they caught all of the attention of a man named Yin Zheng, who would later be called Qin Shi Huang. Now, if you don't know who Qin Shi Huang is, then you definitely need to stick around and find out, because he's an interesting guy, as he is the first man to conquer all of China, and he is China's first emperor. So stick around for that. Now, Yin Zheng, as he was called at the time, was a total fanboy of Han Feize, and he was desperate to meet the skilled writer. Now, this just so happens that the third man in this episode comes into effect, and his name is Li Si. Li Si was born in around 280 BC, so at the same time as Han Feize, and he died at around 208 BC. Now, his death is interesting as well, but it won't be covered in this episode because he meets his demise a bit later, so I reckon it's better to keep that for a future episode. But anyway, all we need to know about Li Si just now is this. He was also a student of Sun Si, and personally knew Han Feize, and at that time he was serving in the Qin court. So he thought to himself, if I get Han Feize brought over to meet my duke or my king, I will be a hero in his eyes. So of course, Li Si thinks of a plan and thinks, how could we get Han Feize over here? So with that in mind, Yin Zheng was in actually a pretty strong position to demand anything he wanted from Han already. And the reason why is because, like I said, the state of Han was already rather weak, and the Qin were a huge entity at the time. So this is like moving on, like we've kind of moved on from the Spring and Autumn period, and we're now in the War and States period, where there's a bunch of larger states all competing to take over the entire realm. But it just so happened that Han was probably one of the smallest ones around, and Qin's on their doorstep. So you could imagine how this was going to go down. So the Qin, after beating the Han up in a few battles, say, okay, now is the time for peace talks. Oh, good. But who will discuss the peace talks? And then this is when Qin say, we want Han Feize, nobody else. Now, I reckon both sides would have been happy with this deal. Han got rid of Han Feize, who they probably thought was an annoyance more than anything else, and they got peace with Qin. Qin, on the other side, see this as a win, as they get a really capable minister who agrees with the king's points of views. And what about Han Feize? Was he happy with this? Well, yes, he was. He was extremely happy. He must have thought, no longer will I be a disgraced minister of Han. I will win back peace for my country. I'll be a hero. Except when he got there, he was welcomed to a huge party thrown by none other than Yin Zheng himself, and was welcomed as a guest of honour. Han Feize then quickly shined inside the imperial court and within the king's eyes. It was pretty clear from then on that Yin Zheng intended to employ Han Feize and implement his ideas. Han Feize would never return home. Now, remember Li Si? How do you think he feels about this? He brought in Han Feize as he thought it would win him favour with Yin Zheng. But what's happened instead? He's been totally forgotten about. I could picture a minister saying, "Sire, Li Si wants to see you," to which Yin Zheng would reply, "Li who?" Now of course this is definitely hyperbole. Li Si would still have been remembered as he played a pivotal role within the Qin court. However, Han Feize seemed to be a genuine threat to his position, and Li Si himself even knew that Han Feize was more capable than him. Therefore, he had to get rid of him. Now, I have read two tales as to what happens next, so I'll leave it up to you to decide which one you want to believe. Yin Zheng, Han Feizi, and Li Si were debating on how to launch a campaign to unify the realm. Li Si insisted on invading Han first. They were the closest neighbour and the weakest state when looking at a map. However, Han Feizi said that invading Han first wasn't the best option. From there, Li Si accused Han Feizi as being a traitor to Yin Zheng and says he is still loyal to the Han. Even after all that Qin has done for him, Han Feizi was then thrown into jail. The second is pretty similar. Li Si just charges Han Feizi with duplicity and then has him thrown in jail. And duplicity is basically a doubtness of your speech and actions, or your speech contradicts your actions, so to speak. It seems like he managed to trump up these charges in any case, and Han Feizi was thrown in jail. The thing is, Yin Zheng was actually feeling regretful of this, and he planned to release Han Feizi, but Li Si put a stop to that in an extremely cruel way. He ordered Han Feizi to commit suicide and gave him a vial of poison. There was probably a note of some sort there saying die with honour rather than be disgraced in court or something along those lines. Now please remember that this is my speculation here. There is no evidence that Li Si left a note with that statement on it. But you know, you get the idea. Han Feizi, surprisingly, obliged, and he drank the poison. Now I know what you're thinking. That Li Si, what a total snake. And I guess you'd be right. However, he did go on to serve the state of Qin well, and a short while after Han Feizi's death, the state of Qin would go on to unite all of the realm that once belonged to the Zhou, and even expand it further. Now, a big reason for the success of Qin and China's first emperor was due to this, their ideology, which was legalism. Now, I'm not going to get into the Qin dynasty yet, just because there are a few more philosophies or writings I think need to be covered before I can move forward. However, what I will say is that from this time and into the future, Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism all play huge roles in the formation and the running of future Chinese dynasties, as we will soon see moving forward. Then, later on down the line, there's another fourth major player, which is Buddhism, but we'll get more into that later as well, just because it hasn't really been introduced to China yet. Now, as well as this, as much as I said much of Qin's success was based on legalism, which it was, because that's how they managed to gear themselves up and fight the rest of the warring states and defeat them in battle, it also played a huge role in their downfall as well. But again, like that, I'm just giving you a little teaser because we're going to move into the Qin dynasty very soon, so I'm excited for that. But anyway, next week's podcast will be covering the works of Sun Tzu and his most epic of books, The Art of War. Now I hope you have enjoyed this episode, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the Chronicler Podcast channel. Thanks for listening.